In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the long bone, specifically looking at individual structures and their functions. These are the learning objectives associated with today's lessons. We are going to be focusing on 4 and 5 in particular. For this lesson, it's really important that you read page 207 of your textbook. Make sure that you are able to understand the content there and look at the glossary for these keywords. The keywords, as ever, are listed here. By the end of this lesson, you should be confident in discussing and using these words in the context of questions. So first of all, we're going to be looking at the structure of bone. Now, this electron micrograph image is showing compact bone. And these little black dots that you can see here contain bone cells. So this material that looks kind of pink and white in places, this is the matrix of bone tissue, and these are the cells, these black kind of oval shaped things. So what this tells us is that bone is a connective tissue. So bone is a connective tissue because it has cells in a non-cellular matrix. And bone cells are called osteocytes. And that non-cellular matrix is comprised of inorganic salts that contain calcium and phosphorus, which makes it really dense and rigid. Now, even though bone has this arrangement and structure, bone is living, and that's really important to understand. Bone is living tissue. So when we start looking at other different types of connective tissue, they all have similar properties. They are all cells within a matrix. So you can see that here with different forms of cartilage. You can see that with fat, so that is cells within a matrix again, with blood tissue and of course with bone. This video just shows you a summary of bone cells and how they are produced and how they are broken down. I'd like you to watch that in your own time. It's a really good summary. So what we're going to be focusing on today's lesson is the structure of the long bone. Particularly, we look at the femur, that's the long bone in the thigh. This part up here you can see will connect with the pelvic bone, and this part down here will connect with the patella and the tibia and fibula to form the knee joint. Now you can see in this diagram that the long bone itself has two regions. It has these swollen regions at the bottom and the top, and each one is called an epiphysis. And together, both of them are referred to as epiphyses. Now, the epiphyses have these enlarged swollen areas, and the reason for that is because they articulate or interact with other bones. Now, they don't rub bone on bone. We have a layer of cartilage at the ends of the bones, which is known as articular cartilage. The shaft of the bone itself is known as the diaphysis. Now, if we look at more detail of these different parts of the bone, we can see that it's made up of two types of bone, which are very, very different from each other. We have cancellous or spongy bone, and we can see that when we zoom in on it, it looks like a natural sponge. And we also have compact bone, and as that name also suggests, all the bone cells are really tightly knit together within that matrix. Now, the reason why we know that bone is living tissue is that if you break it or damage it, you will get blood loss. And you can see those blood vessels running through the center of these concentric circles. So first of all, we're going to be looking at the diaphysis. So that is the long shaft of the bone. So this is this long region here. And we can see that the diaphysis is made up of compact bone. So that's this material here. And it surrounds the yellow bone marrow. And the reason why this bone marrow is yellow is because it stores fat. Now, if we look at the epiphyses of the long bone, so this is the region at the bottom and the top end of the bone. So this picture of bone is inverted, and this region, as I said before, would articulate with the pelvis, and this region would articulate or interact with the knee joint. We can see that there are lots of holes in this area of the bone tissue, like a sponge, so hence it is often described as spongy bone. So we can see that this dense line here around the outside, all of this stuff here is compact bone, and in the middle we have that cancellous or spongy bone. Now it's called spongy bone because it is more porous, and crucially, cancellous or spongy bone at the epiphyses contains red bone marrow. Now on the outside of the bone we have this really dense fibrous white covering which gives bones their whitish colour, and this outer layer covering bones is called the periosteum. Now we know that any word associated with bone has the word ost in it, so for example bone cells are called osteocytes, so periosteum means the outside covering of the bone. At the end we can see this blue material here, and this is the articular cartilage. Now, the reason why we have articular cartilage instead of periosteum covering the bone at these regions is this is the sites where our bones will interact with other bones, and therefore we need to have this protective layer there. This diagram is simply showing another image of the femur or another long bone. And again, we're just summarizing the key features here. So the long shaft of the bone is called the diaphysis. And within the center of the diaphysis, we can see that there is yellow bone marrow, which is where fat is stored. And this is surrounded by compact bone. And you can see these densely compact regions round about it. And then we have this outer covering, which is called the periosteum. When we look at the ends of the bones, we have this spongy bone, which is found in the epiphyses. And this is what spongy bone looks like closer up. And then you can see that it's quite porous. And then the outer side of that, we have that compact bone. And where that bone interacts with another bone, we have this protective layer of articular cartilage instead of that periosteum. So just to make sure you've understood what we've talked about so far, I'd like you to pause the video and see if you can label this diagram of the long bone using these words. Once you've done that, unpause the video and we'll go over the answers. Okay, so hopefully you were able to at least get 50% of those words correct. If not, please go back and have another go. These are the names of the different regions of the bone that we've discussed. One that might be new to you is the medullary cavity, but hopefully you were able to understand that the word cavity means space. So where you don't have any bone marrow and it's empty, that would be a cavity, hence medullary cavity. So that would have been a simple process of elimination. So now that we understand that the long bone is made up of two types of bone, that's compact bone and spongy bone, we're now going to look at the compact bone in more detail. So remembering this is mostly found in the diaphysis and also covering the ends of the epiphyses. We know that osteocytes are bone cells. Now these osteocytes live in functional units called osteons. Sometimes osteons are known as Herversian systems, and you can use either term, but I'm going to go with osteons. So osteons, which you can see in this diagram here, are the units of compact bone. And what we can see here is that one osteon sits in close contact with another one. And within the osteons, you have osteocytes or bone cells. And you can see that here, here, and here. You can see between those osteocytes, there is this kind of cream-colored space in between. And this is the connective tissue made up of the inorganic salts. And those inorganic salts are nutrients such as calcium and phosphorus. So when we look at osteons, we see that they have a central canal, or a Herversian canal if you're going with the term Herversian system. Now this is in the center of that osteon, that concentric circle unit. And within the center you have blood vessels, because it's a living structure, therefore it needs to receive nutrients and take away waste. We have nerves, because again we need to detect sensations. And there's lymph capillaries, which will help the products of fat digestion to be moved around the body, as well as moving white blood cells. Now these osteons, as I've said before, are arranged in concentric rings, and these rings that center around the central canal are called lamellae, or layers. So these layers are called lamellae. Now within each lamellae you have spaces, and then in those spaces, this is where we find the bone cells. Now these bone cells have to sit in a space, and that space is called. Now all of these words sound quite difficult to start with, and I will show you a diagram of that in a second. Now, just to reiterate, an osteon is one functional unit. At the center of an osteon we have central canals, which contain blood vessels, nerves, and lymph capillaries. And these key structures tell us that osteons are living tissue. Within that osteon, we have these concentric rings. So if you think about throwing a stone on water, you have those rings coming out. Those are called concentric rings. And in the case of an osteon, those concentric rings are referred to as lamellae, and those are the layers. Now, in between each of those rings, we have osteocytes, which are bone cells, and they have to sit in their own little space called lacunae. Now, in order for these osteocytes to talk to each other, they use canals called canaliculi. So the canaliculi run between osteocytes in the different lamellae or layers, and they connect information and materials from cell to cell. And these osteons are long, and they run the length of the bone. So an osteon is as long as your thigh bone. So here is a diagram to show you what I've been talking about. In this cartoon picture here, we can see one osteon. In the center of that osteon, we can see a blood vessel here, but not the nerves, the lymph, but this would be the central canal. And we can see that running down the length of that long bone. If we look at this diagram here, we can see this cream-colored material, which is the layers of the osteon, or lamellae. And between these layers, we have the osteocytes sitting in a space called a lacuna. And in this diagram here, this is an actual electron micrograph picture of an osteon in real life. And again, at the center of that, we have the central canal. We can see those lamellae round about, And these dark regions, we can see that these are the osteocytes sitting inside a lacuna. The one thing that we haven't mentioned so far are the canaliculi. And here we can see these branching threads that connect each of these osteocytes, and those are the canaliculi. So this diagram here is just another picture to show you how compact bone is arranged in real life. So we can see quite easily the central canals, and we can see these osteocytes, and we can also make out one osteon. And again, if we zoom in on an image, we can see these canals that connect one osteon to another, and those are the canaliculi. And in this image here, you can see this halo around that dark region, and that halo is the lacuna or space where the osteon sits inside. Now, the reason why I'm showing you so many of these different pictures is because an exam question will ask you to label each of these structures and identify them. So it's important that you're able to see different images and get used to looking at the different structures of compact bone. So this diagram is actually showing a video which will go through bone growth and repair, and it refers to all the key terminologies that I've discussed so far. I would encourage you to pause the video and look at that before continuing on. However, if you want to just continuing on, we will look at the other type of bone, which is spongy bone. Now, when we look at spongy or cancellous bone, we can see that the arrangement is very, very different to compact bone. It's called spongy bone because you have these spaces in between it, and it does resemble an actual sponge. So first of all, we can see that very quickly this bone is not arranged in osteons, so it doesn't have those tight concentric rings. And instead, we have these stick-like thin bony branches or plates known as trabeculae. So cancellous or spongy bone is arranged in trabeculae. Now, what's crucial about this arrangement is that the osteocytes, these bone cells, are found inside the trabeculae, so you can't really see them. And the other important thing to note is that the nerves and blood vessels will thread their way through these spaces between the trabeculae. So if we look here at this diagram, we can see a cartoon image of spongy bone anatomy, and we can see the trabeculae, remembering that the osteocytes are inside and the blood vessels thread their way through the outside. Here is a real image of a bone, and you can quite clearly see the structure of that spongy bone, and you can really see quite clearly the individual trabeculae. So here's another cartoon image, again showing the same thing. Please take the time to notice that we still have layers. The osteocytes are inside the trabeculae. We have got these canals or canaliculi, but we don't have those central canals. Okay, so again, another picture of the spongy bone. Now, what's important to note about spongy bone is that we have blood vessels that feed their way through. And why that's significant is because at the ends of the bone, if I go back to this image here, at the ends in the epiphyses of the spongy bone, we do not have yellow bone marrow, but what we do have is red bone marrow. So in that background space where you can see here where it looks kind of orangey, this is where you will find red bone marrow, which is where blood cells are made. To summarize what we've learned so far, we know that the long bone contains a shaft called the diaphysis, and this is where most of the compact bone is found. Now, the compact bone has a medullary cavity which consists of yellow bone marrow, and yellow bone marrow is where fat is stored. The ends of these long bones are called the epiphyses or singular epiphyses, and this is chiefly where spongy bone is found. Now, spongy bone contains red bone marrow where blood cells are formed. Now, compact bone is made of many Haversian systems or osteons. You can use either terminology. Each osteon or Haversian system has a central canal surrounded by concentric lamellae or layers. The spaces between the lamellae are called lacunae, and within the lacunae you will find osteocytes or bone cells. The lacunae are connected by canals called canaliculi in these osteons. Now, looking at spongy bone, we know that this is made up of irregular bony plates called trabeculae, and the osteocytes or bone cells are found within the trabeculae. Now, that's the end of today's lesson. Please ensure that you complete pages 6 to 9 of your booklet, and please ensure that you read pages 207 to 210 of your textbook. That is essential to help you understand the terminology and to be successful in answering questions effectively.